Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Using Landing Zones to Define Success. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jesse Bronson, the Marketing Manager at Construx, and today I'm happy to introduce to you Erik Simmons, a Senior Fellow here at Construx. Erik has nearly 30 years of experience as an engineer, consultant, and change agent in software and systems in both the public and private sector. Erik is internationally recognized for his expertise in areas such as agile, software and systems life cycles, solutions thinking, complex adaptive systems engineering, and requirements engineering. Erik, thanks for being here. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jesse, and welcome everyone. I guess good afternoon or good evening or good whatever it is, wherever you are. Topic today is using landing zones to define success. So over the course of this talk, we're going to talk about how to overcome this particular challenge. A lot of the people we end up working with don't have any explicit definition of success that they're working towards. And if they do, and they produce one, it's often rather incomplete. It has representation of some people and some perspectives, but hardly a full picture. And the challenge is here in this little network diagram, because you have stakeholders, obviously, just to pick on one of these categories. And I usually can get a team quickly to note 12, perhaps 18 or 24 different groups of stakeholders that are holding some material stake in their product. That's not individuals, that's just groups. So once you populate those groups with the individual stakeholders, it's dozens, sometimes hundreds. And that's just one of these categories. Lots and lots of interaction, ecosystems themselves, and to pick on another one, that can be very complex, multi-layered dependencies that go in there. So when you're trying to tease a definition of success out of this, it's not one of those really simple and easy to do things. So enter the landing zone as a way to get that done. Because what happens if we don't? If we don't actually go off and define success, lots of bad things tend to end up happening. You can miss a stakeholder expectation, and you discover that late in the project, and then it's unrecoverable because it's so late in the project that you've got to go over and do a bunch of work again, or this person just ends up unhappy and may not want to pay their stake into the result. The lack of a single unifying definition of success also gets groups and individuals to work at different perceptions of success, sometimes working directly against each other on a large project without realizing it. And it's always tough, without knowing what success looks like, to see where you are towards truly done. Yep, there's product scope, there's project scope, but that's only one facet of really done and successful. So if all you track is your progress against scope, that doesn't mean you're going to be successful either. And after the work is done, you end up without much accountability for the results, because nobody ever defines success versus failure, so I guess we're okay. And there's many, many more than this. So the lack of a good definition of success can be really problematic later on. So then what do we mean by a good definition of success? Here I like to borrow something from the requirements engineering discipline. And I think our definition of success has to satisfy the 3 C's: clear, common, and coherent. So you see the definitions here in front of you. I won't read them to you necessarily. And I would normally say if you have a question on them, just drop it into the Q&A, but Microsoft Teams is helping us today by blocking that. Do feel free to email, and recognize we're on a small time delay. So if Jesse gets a question that he has to jump in and we'll answer right away, we'll do that. It'll probably be a minute or so after you ask it, but we'll get to your questions. Even if it's after the talk, Jesse will forward them to me and I'll deal with them that way. I'm not going to let technology spoil your experience. So clear and common. Not only does everybody have to understand success, we all have to share the same understanding of success. And then that definition has to be coherent, as you see here, consistent, logical, and making sense as a whole. And my joke is you'll find out if this isn't true eventually, but the longer you wait, the harder it is to deal with, the more expensive it gets to deal with as well. So into this mix, we drop this landing zone thing. So first, let me give you the anatomical definition of a landing zone, and then we'll talk a bit more about some of the context for this, the history of that. So a landing zone is a table. And you see in the diagram, the rows are the success attributes. The columns represent performance levels. Okay, and these performance levels are by default given across three achievement levels. First is minimum, which we define as that level above which you succeed and below which you fail. It's that dividing line between success and failure, minimally successful. And then you have an anticipated level of achievement. We'll call that the target. Generally, that's some distance above minimum. And then we have great success, outstanding. That really is defined technically as what would happen if everything went absolutely perfectly, which it almost never does. But if it did, what would we get to? All right. And the success attributes are the subset of all the things that could be true about your project that really materially define success or failure. You see, note here that not everything about your project or product is directly related to success. And that's one of the difficulties with this, is people tend to put too much into the landing zone. One of the things it's going to force you to do is have the tough conversation. So before I show you an example, where did this come from? What the heck is the story behind this? Well, landing zones came to be right around the turn of this century. So they're about to become 21 years old, and I don't know what they'll do on their birthday. But they were created at Intel. Back when I joined the company, I ran into two people, a strategic planner and a platform quality analyst, an engineer, who were working on this concept called a landing zone. Now, you might recognize that Intel was the company that invented the OKR. Andy Grove did that decades before the landing zone was created. So this came out of the same basic environment and need to track progress on big, complex, important projects. And Intel's culture, I can tell you at that time especially, was very opt-in. You couldn't walk up and say, I want you all to start using landing zones, and expect to do anything but get one eyebrow raised at you and a shake of the head, and they'll ignore you, right? Unless they want to, if it works. And I was struck by the fact that landing zones went through product development from stem to stern in no more than 12 to 15 months. So this thing spread like wildfire, where it had taken a decade to get a life cycle installed. Landing zones went flying through the environment in just a year. And the popularity, I think, speaks to the general level of usefulness and ease of use for all of this. The name itself is borrowed from a physical metaphor. If you were on a highway and there was a bad wreck in front of you, you might see the fire department set up a landing zone for a medical helicopter next to the highway, where the LZ, where the helicopter can land safely. And the same was used in the Vietnam War for where they would drop troops. The same is used even on an aircraft carrier for the spot on the deck where the arresting cables exist and you want your tail hook to land. You want to hit that landing zone someplace. If you miss it, you go around, or bad things happen. So the landing zone is a metaphoric region. It has more than 2 dimensions or even 3 dimensions. It has n dimensions that we'll talk about. And that's the way that the name came about. Okay, so developed at the same place that gave you the OKR, and very popular in that environment to this day. So let's look at one of these. I want to show you the success attributes and performance levels. I made up an example. I could never show you a real one of these because I'd be shot. Don't even have any of the old ones. Here's a made up example for a gaming system. If our project was to go off and create a gaming system, this is the sort of thing that I might expect to see in a landing zone that governed the success or failure of our overall effort. When does it get onto the shelf? What's it cost to make? How many people are involved? Where can we launch? What have we got to play with when we launch? And how many will we sell in the first year? Those are the sorts of things that rise up and say, if you don't do this, you fail. So these aren't the more trivial details of what's going on underneath. Now you'll look at this and say, oh, I see some interesting things. First off, you can see that peak project headcount gets better as it's smaller, and so does manufacturing cost. But titles at launch and first year volume get better as they go up. And that's just an intrinsic quantity property. Some things are bigger, better, some things are smaller, better. And landing zones can handle all of that. You will probably see more things that you can put into this. So that is basically what a landing zone is. This is just a subset of one. We'll see in a minute that 12 to 18 rows, 24 maximum is our heuristic. So this is part of a landing zone, but I want to make sure you can read it all. So there you go. Simple table. Inside this, success. Outside this, failure in any row. All right. What are these good for? The first thing they do is make the definition of success explicit at the beginning of the project and allow you to keep it up to date throughout the project. That's important because if someone doesn't agree with what you've written and published, they can speak up. If this thing is implicit, then you'll never know whether or not someone disagrees or to what degree they disagree. In teaching requirements engineering across Intel, I used to joke that these techniques are like a magic flashlight that can illuminate thought balloons. Because when you're in a conference room with a bunch of enthusiastic people at the beginning of a project like our gaming system, people will start to use language that's rather vague, positive, hopeful, but vague. And they'll say, well, this has to be twice as good as anything that's ever come before. And how do you measure that? State-of-the-art usable. All these things that everybody nods and says, yeah, really easy to use, quick to set up. And yet, if you had the magic flashlight to see everyone's thought balloons, you realize, oh, you all have something different above your head. And you're going to find that out eventually. It's much cheaper and easier to find that out very, very early so that you can correct in PowerPoint slides and pixels rather than getting out and correcting project or product designs or things like that. So once you have this explicit definition of success, we also are going to quantify. You saw that this table, this example here, everything's quantified and notated. It's not just faster or better or cheaper, it's got real numbers on it. And that quantification is a key element of this. The landing zone is based in part in the discipline that Tom Guild created with competitive engineering, as he published in 2006. And actually, it goes all the way back to his previous book in 1988, Principles of Software Engineering Management. And the quantification aspect of this is quite central to the utility of things like landing zones, because if you have quantified success, you can use these numbers when you think about feasibility and risk. And that gives you a much firmer ground to base your assertions and experiments on to understand, can I really do this? Or am I just specifying some pipe dream that's going to fail in the end? During the project, the landing zone also helps drive trade-off discussions. One of the things it does is place everything that's competing for your attention, your resources, your money, in one visual field. 12 to 18 rows, maybe 24. You can fit this on a printed page or a whiteboard. And when you do, you can see that everything's competing and you have to start to make these trade-offs. It's very rare these days that someone comes up with a project that is Gantt chart programmatic. And this is one of the reasons that Agile has been so popular since the manifesto was signed, is that it thrives in an environment where not everything can be preordained and tightly controlled. The landing zone thrives there too. Landing zones also, in the last bullet, make a really fine way to monitor and communicate status to whatever decision forums, oversight forums, management teams care about this during development. Landing zones are terrific to publish broadly and let people see what's going on. Because again, if you have disagreement in this area, the cheapest, best time to know is right up front. Okay, so I mentioned length. How long are these things? Well, the good news is they're not very long. One visual field at a glance, so 24 rows at most, and a dozen rows is much better. Now, that's pleasant, but it also makes it a little tougher because you can't just start throwing kitchen sinks into this thing. You're going to have a lot of discussions as you work on these, sometimes intense discussions about whether some row deserves a membership in the landing zone or not. If so, why? If not, why not? But keep in mind as you do this, the bottom line down there, landing zones are all about success, not scope. You have other ways, better ways, to capture the entire scope of what you're doing. Landing zones are about what separates success from failure, and that's not everything. Now, before you get too despairing of the fact that you only get 24 rows, there is the notion that a landing zone could be nested within a different one. This is quite common, especially in our gaming system where we have hardware and we have software and we have ecosystem enabling and we have some other things that we can consider to be components of the overall system. I'm able to keep the top level landing zone very lean and focused on the things that have to be reviewed regularly by upper management and still get into some detail to help guide some of these component teams. As Conway's law would predict, generally we're organized around our architecture. And you're going to have people working on the software or working on the hardware or working on ecosystem enabling. And those folks can be informed by child landing zones that get linked to one or more rows of a parent landing zone. This just cascades down, and you can help guide people with 12 to 24 rows of success definition at multiple levels and maintain that up-down coherence with an overall vision and success as expressed by the top level landing zone. Okay, and as you see here, kitchen hint, the tabs of a spreadsheet can be quite good for this if you have various child landing zones underneath a global parent. Okay, now you've got a landing zone. Keep your eye on it because it changes. The success definition on most projects changes almost continuously. And lots of reasons here on this slide, right? Stakeholder groups and stakeholders come and go because the people you start with aren't necessarily going to make the entire journey with you. And you'll find some new friends along the way. And among the people you know are stakeholders, they will experience events and forces in their own lives that will cause their needs and preferences to change with time. And outside of your stakeholders, the market itself will change. And your competitors are going to do things that might thrill you because they fall on their face, or terrify you because they exceed your expectations on terms of projections of what they do. All of those things have to be incorporated into your ongoing evergreen definition of success. So how do you do that in the landing zone? Generally, that all hits the landing zone in one of these two ways. You either add or remove an entire row because it's newly relevant or no longer relevant, or you end up changing values for minimum, target, or outstanding. The minimum and the outstanding, again, are sort of boundary levels. The target is what we're really hoping to achieve on typical performance. Any of those might change based on these external forces that continue to affect your project. So keep things up to date. Now, you might be thinking about priority, and I want to contrast that with importance. The trouble with landing zones is that they're really not good for managing priorities. Everything in a landing zone is vitally important. That's the definition of success. We need everything. And once you're in the landing zone, the zone itself really doesn't dictate where you go. As long as you stay in the landing zone, you are within the success region. You have the autonomy to go off and do what you need to. So it's not really dictating priority. Everything in there is important. It's up to you then to manage your priority. Don't do it in the landing zone. You're going to have other ways to do that. You're gonna find backlogs and other things that help you manage the exact priority and the order in which you go and do things. What the bottom line here says, I think it's very important, again, tracing back to that first slide, landing zones provide what we would call the necessary ambiguity to succeed in a complex situation. Okay, teams need wiggle room, maneuvering space. You can't over-constrain the success definition, or you really just guarantee failure. Okay, now we can say a little more about priority and landing zones, because early on, your priority is often informed, at least, not dictated. I chose that word kind of carefully. They're informed by how big the gap is between where you are now and where minimum is. Because if you're below minimum, then okay, you're in a pretty desperate situation. I've got to get this attribute above minimum. And the farther below minimum I am, the more important that might be to pay attention to. But let's say we've worked on some of those and now we've reached minimum at least in everything else. Now, all right, my priority is no longer driven by the fact that I need to get everything to minimum. I have other concerns. And you'll find that there are a lot of nuances within priority here within the landing zone. There are dependencies among rows and target levels. Somebody might tell you that if row 3 only hits minimum, row 5 really needs to be above target, because that's some subtle stuff that a landing zone and a simple tool like that just can't really express. People sometimes put these in as design rule-like things to accompany a landing zone, and that might work for you, but don't expect the table itself to inform you of that. And you see, it's better to manage these dynamic priorities elsewhere, like backlogs, or even in an evolutionary delivery plan. If you're an adherent to competitive engineering, it has a baked-in tool for doing that kind of work. Okay, so landing zones are about importance, not necessarily about priority. That's up to you. Construx does a lot of organizational assessments. For all I know, some of you who are listening have done one with us. And when we do these, we often hear parallel complaints within one organization. Up in the management, the C-suite level, we hear management complain, for the lack of a better word, that the teams they manage won't commit to anything, and they need predictability. We need to know what's ahead. But then if I go and talk to the people who are individual contributors at the team level, their complaint is that they have no autonomy, and management wants to dictate every decision and decide every detail for them. And in this kind of a gulf, we're supposed to be successful, and that just doesn't work. So one thing I want to point out for you is that landing zones correct both these problems at once. Because a landing zone is the definition of the quantitative region in which a team commits to deliver something. Because once you accept a landing zone, say, yep, that's it, we're headed there, you've now committed quite clearly, quantitatively, publicly, that we're going to deliver something inside this region. So management knows they're going to get something in there. And everybody can see the boundaries of what you've defined and the current status of the work. I'm going to show you more about status tracking. But the transparency of a landing zone, there is nowhere to hide. So everybody's going to know where things are in terms of, are we being successful or not at all times? Okay? And it also becomes quickly apparent if the success region becomes infeasible, right? Because suddenly you drop below minimum in something, and you can start to fire a flare and say, we need some help because this is, our price target is now becoming infeasible, or we don't have enough titles for our gaming system, or it's going to be too expensive to make. Whatever it is, you get those changes out in the open and ask, is this still real, or are we in trouble? Okay. Now, at the same time, landing zones create autonomy by clarifying the decision authority that a team has. If a decision you want to make within your landing zone doesn't violate any row of the landing zone, that's yours to make. There's no escalation required. So long as you maintain all levels of the landing zone, or all rows of the landing zone between minimum and outstanding levels, that is by definition of the landing zone success. But if you have any one row that would go outside of the minimum outstanding range because of an act you might take, that very clearly has to be escalated because you're now threatening the definition of success. So how many times do you hear people say, we want to push decision-making down to the lowest levels? We want to give people distributed decision authority. We want to increase autonomy. I hear it universally. Everyone wants that. But when you say, what are the practical techniques to really make this happen, that gets a lot thinner. Now, here is a technique that will do that. You're going to establish a very firm boundary in which the team has autonomy that defines success, and then you're going to get a very strong commitment based on that quantitative region for what's going to be delivered at the end. And you know exactly when you have to escalate to management for approval versus just make the decision yourself. This alone, I think, is worth doing this technique for. All right, now over the years, 21 years real soon now is the birthday, landing zones have been sort of added to in a couple of interesting and useful ways. So I'm adding some of these in yellow just so you can see what people have done to embellish the basic attribute minimum target outstanding set that is the default landing zone. Top row here, you see people add a now, and that's a way to really emphasize status. Where are we today? And you keep that evergreen, and anybody can walk up and stare at the landing zone wherever you keep it and know exactly what's happening. It's a bit like a Kanban board in that regard, where if you keep your Kanban board up to date, it's a wonderful pull system that shows everybody where we are right now. Landing zones can function in the same basic way, where you don't have to push status to anyone. Publish this thing where it's visible, keep it up to date, and let people pull status at that moment when they want it, and you never worry about, oh, that presentation was last week, you need the new one. Right. Teams also can add a kill switch below minimum. That is taken from off-road vehicles. The kill switch has a little pin in it attached to a cable attached to your wrist, so that if you become detached from the ATV, the engine cuts and it just doesn't ride down the beach without you, striking several seals and a few people. So kill switch is there saying that, look, if we get far enough below minimum, we really ought to stop and say, is this project viable? It's not uncommon to dip below minimum because maybe a competitor had a good day and you've got to adjust your minimum and say, whoops, we have some work to do. But if I ask you for a credible recovery plan and I see one, says, oh, yeah, we just need a few more bucks and a few more days and we can make that up, then we're fine. But eventually, if you keep slipping, you're going to have to ask that question of, are we really doing something that's going to end even remotely in success? And the kill switch is that moment where you call the question. And you can specify that for every attribute if you like. And then especially in larger organizations and larger projects, people put an owner column in there because you might be looking at a landing zone and you have a question about the attribute itself, or maybe you question the minimum or the outstanding and you say, I need to talk to somebody because I don't think that's right. Who should I talk to? And often these success attributes are moderately technical. They have specialists who sort of own them. And that's who you would go and talk to about this and have those debates. So any or all of these are yours to add if you like. The default landing zone simply has the first four in the top line, attribute, minimum, target, outstanding. If you find other things, more power. There's also a graphical visualization of a landing zone. This is more work than just creating a table and typing numbers. But I think in the next slide, I'll show you an example of our gaming landing zone, a piece of it in this format. I think you'll see that there is a payoff for the extra work of creating this kind of visualization. It imparts a lot of information at a glance. There's no interpretation required about now in a row of a table where you see the blue triangle pointing to where we're at. You can get even fancier because now I can even decorate that blue arrow or the blue triangle with an arrow that points to trend. Is it stable now? Is it moving toward minimum? Am I increasing toward target? What's my forecast? Where do I think I'm going? So you can impart a lot of information in a very small space if you choose to take the extra time to make this into a graphical element. And when you put several of these together, you see what I mean about not having to interpret the table. So this is roughly the same thing, again, a subset, just for visualizing in a slide. But you can make this up and you can quickly see where we're sitting pretty and where we might want to spend a little bit of attention. Okay, below minimum, trending toward kill switch, or we're just above minimum on retail on shelf. And you could put kill switch in here too if you felt like it, to the left, just more work. All right, so there is that graphical visualization of the landing zone itself. One last thing about landing zone mechanics. Sometimes you have functions and constraints. In our examples, all of the things in the landing zone have generally been things like price or date or other attributes that are measurable on a continuous interval, or at least some numeric, clearly numeric basis for minimum target outstanding. Functions and constraints aren't like that. Functions are present or absent in your system. Constraints are either met or they're not. And those don't often appear in the crucial definition of success, their scope, and they can be important. In those rare cases, though, that they rise to the level of landing zone inclusion, here is the way that you can drop them in there. Generally, they would appear in one row, and generally, these function and constraint lists tend to be cumulative across minimum, target, and outstanding. And you see we have a nifty little shorthand to represent that and save you some typing, decrease visual clutter. Here, you see the minimum for our gaming system might be dual monitor support and 3G and USB 2. Well, this is an old example, obviously, but it still works. Now, in the target space, it's min plus. That means everything that was in the column to the left and these two things. And in the right, you see target plus, same song, second verse. It's everything in the left column and the left column, plus USB-C and Thunderbolt. Okay, so you generally have these accumulating function and constraint lists across the top. In a rare case where you have unique lists, you can put those in too. But these shouldn't appear very often, and they really shouldn't be too numerous. It's got to be a very important function to show up in a landing zone. Okay, here's one other example for you. For a car, notice again that price is better lower, mileage is better higher. You could look at this and say, you're crazy. That's not what success looks like in a car. And I would just say, that's the point. If you disagree with this, now is the time before we bought the car. Maybe you don't care about interior noise. As a musician, I do. I don't like the noise. I always wear earplugs on airplanes because that noise level for several hours just fatigues the heck out of me. But maybe you say, it doesn't matter. And you could probably add several rows to this. Okay, so you see here that a landing zone can even be good for a big decision about what car to buy, what's your next house going to look like. My children even use this. You're going to laugh at this. I won't hear you, thank God, but you'll laugh at this. My children both use this to help decide where to go to college. Because if you had children who shop for college, you probably realize that the amount of email and regular mail that shows up, it literally filled several boxes at our house. And paralyzed by choice doesn't begin to describe how my kids felt about what confronted them there. All these schools, all these places. So, all right, let's cut through some of the dross and get to some good stuff. So we sat down and had that conversation about what are the a dozen things that you really care about. Do you care how big the city is the school's in? How far is it to the beach? How far is it from home? Do you care whether it's liberal arts or not? What do you care about? And once they came up with that list, we put that in the landing zone, and it just totally disqualified several schools off the bat. And then it allowed them to reason within the landing zone and make the trade-offs that they would make to narrow the field and pick one from the select set. So maybe this is useful even beyond work, who knows? Okay, here's one more example in the visual format for an organizational improvement project. You're trying to reduce rework percent. You can see the minimum target outstanding and kill switch levels is specified here. So we got work to do on reducing rework in this organization. Doing okay on how many stories we're completing per sprint. Again, you might not like that. Maybe you like velocity. This particular organization had normalized its story size, and it was easy enough to count stories, not count story points. But you could be in a totally different place, and that's important to know before you specify the landing zone. And you see the rest of these, just they got work to do, but the status of what they're doing is quite clear. And I think this informs, but does not dictate, where your priorities would be. Everything here is important. Alrighty. One last point that usually I hear you asking, even though the chat's not working. Okay, what about OKRs? And I just want to point out that there are some real similarities and differences. I mentioned both come from Intel. Both are used now outside of Intel. They've escaped successfully, profitably. And you see here, I won't read all this to you, but you can see a basic description of some of the differences here. Landing zones are about a region of success. OKRs are about strategy and goals over a specified amount of time. Intel typically did quarterly and annual OKRs. Landing zones contain elements that directly define success and failure. OKRs have 3 to 5 objectives at some level, not 12 to 24 rows. OKRs generally are measurable all in the same way. Whatever an organization adopts as a scoring mechanism, they tend to use it across all OKRs. Intel was quite fond of the 0.5, 1.0, and 1.25. Now, if you squint a little bit, you might say kill switch, minimum, target, outstanding, with those numbers of 0.5, and you wouldn't be wrong. Right? There are some connections in the emergence of landing zones at a company that already did this for OKRs. But landing zones are a bit different in the sense that each row can be measured across a different unit scale. You're not just going to arbitrarily start to translate those to 0 and 0.5 and 1.0. So it's a little bit different, but in the case of the landing zone, the success attributes are always quantified in some units of measure. So can you use these together? Absolutely. Do you have to use OKRs with landing zones? No, but you can. A row of a landing zone at a really, really high corporate level might generate OKRs for a particular group for a quarter. Like, okay, how are we going to get 50 titles into the marketplace for our gaming system this quarter? And I can have an objective for that, and I can have several key results. But the reverse is also true, because if we have an OKR that says launch the gaming system this year, I could then have landing zone upon landing zone nested underneath that to guide the work of teams who are making the products, building the solutions, and actually working on projects to get this done in service of the key results to the objective. So use one, use both, up to you. You shouldn't have any trouble nesting them together in a compatible way. All right, now it's up to you. From here, my advice is to go and create one. One of the best things about this is that you don't have to take your team offline for 2 weeks of training. You don't have to spend a bunch of money on tool licenses. There's no data to convert from one database to another. This isn't like moving from one source code management tool to a different one. You could try this, and I mean you as an individual. If you're listening to this, you could do this in your organization. A low cost, low risk way to see, does this work? And if it fails dismally, you can just evaluate the experiment, say, did I do anything wrong? And either try it again or say, no, that's just not for us. So there really isn't a reason not to try this. So I encourage you to do that. Go make a landing zone. If you know what success is, this is a trivial exercise. You could probably write down a landing zone for a project or a product where you knew the success definition in 10 minutes. It'd still be useful, but it'd be easy. Chances are, though, you're going to struggle, at least in places, because you're going to run into those thought balloons that aren't the same, and people are going to say, wait, that's not what I was thinking at all. And have you talked to so-and-so who has a completely different view of this? And those discussions are where a lot of the value of this technique ends up coming from, because you're going to have those difficult discussions, ideally up front, but even if you're in flight, going back to figure this out, there's no time like the present. And if you can't find something to do at work, try it for something else. Your next vacation spot, your next place to live, whatever it happens to be, just go off and do this. Get the experience of struggling with what really defines success and failure? No kitchen sinks. It's got to be 6, 12, 18 things, 24 max, and then see how it goes. I joke with classes that having been a math major in college and taught math, landing zones were a little like story problems, right? You remember word problems or story problems? They were kind of vicious when you were learning math. The first 100 are the hardest, and then the next million get easier after that. This does take a little practice. We do a lot of these with clients in a workshop setting. You get your people together in a room and hash it out. And it usually goes a half day to 2 days, depending on the size of the group and the number of landing zones, are we nesting, things like that, and just how much they have to argue. But you can try that. If you need the help, let us know, because there are some things you learn with experience about how to quantify various attributes for success. You might have to scratch your head a little and say, wow, okay, I hear it from your tone of voice, that's very important, but how do we measure this? We can help with that. So it just takes a little practice. You'll get there. All right, so you are now, I think, able to go off and do this. I leave you with a kind of a work aid showing most of what we've covered except the graphical parts of it. Jesse, if chat has somehow worked or you've got some emails, this would be a fine time to see if we've got any questions.
Hey, Eric. Yeah, in fact, we've gotten a few emails, and several of them you already actually answered the questions throughout the rest of the presentation, but I'll go ahead and ask you a few more that you probably have covered parts of these too, but I'll go ahead and ask them anyway. So the first one is, what is the best way to get started using landing zones?
Okay, so getting started, right? Okay, the best thing to do is start. Now, where to start? There is a little to think about there. As a new practice, right? Try this in some place where you have a manageable solution, because you want to test the technique. Sometimes you get into a project which is such a hairball that it's the project itself that prevents you from understanding whether or not this technique would even work. There are so many people with such disagreements that this just shines a light on the fact that this project is a hideous mess. And you really don't know if the landing zone would have benefited that project. So, as is usually the case, process improvements are often best trialed in something that isn't critical path and huge. But look for the opportunity you have. Ideally, a landing zone is done at the beginning of a project. So if you have something coming up that's queued where it makes sense to do one now, great. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, if you don't have one that's queued up, just try it on something. Maybe something a little smaller and easier so you can test the technique and not your ability to withstand the mess that occurs when people talk about trying to agree on what success looks like.
All right, here's another question. Is there a tool or tools out there that you can recommend that support landing zone setup and tracking?
No, not in a deep sense. Now, the good news about this is that what you're seeing is quite simple. They show up at, I remember at Intel, I saw most of them in PowerPoint slides. They were kept up to date and posted on a website as an image where you would always just go to the website. The thing would be updated several times a day if need be to keep it constant. It would be lovely. And if any of those of you who are out there are working with tool vendors, yes, please implement this and more of competitive engineering as a primary capability of your tools. I love that. But the good news is you don't need a lot of elegance to get this done right. The graphical visualization, that might be a little more elegant, where people can go in and make a table and then you suddenly get the visualization out of that. And again, some of you may have the skills to automate some of the tools that are there in order to produce this. It's just a table. So sadly, I can't recommend anything which primarily implements this in a really nifty way, but maybe we'll see one soon.
All right, the next question, what mistake do people most often make with landing zones?
They put too much in it and they don't have the difficult conversation to really get down to what matters. Because by putting a row in a landing zone, you are going to make a huge difference in the life of everyone on the project. And it's got to be something that really, really matters. It's materially related to success and failure, not merely sort of important. Because if the landing zone gets too big, it's going to occupy a lot of brain space. You're going to introduce more conflict among the attributes. And if you got something that really is one of the vital few, as you see on the left of this slide, that's competing with something that's only sort of important, I don't want that competition. I want the vital few to win out every time. So I think the most common mistake that people make as they're new to landing zones is they make them too big because they just don't have yet the discipline to force themselves to reduce the size. If you get it above 24, think hard about why is this? Because think about what that says. I'm not going to tell you it's impossible to have a project with more than 24 rows. But if you really find yourself in a project with more than 24 vital attributes that must all be within minimum and outstanding range at the same time, wow, that's high risk. If I'm given a project like that, I go to senior management and say, excuse me, this is an exceptionally risky project. I need more people. I need more money. I need forbearance. I need your priority attention. I need everything to try to land this thing because it's got all kinds of risk in 27 or 36 or 50 things that have to be true all at the same time. So if you can get yourself down to a more manageable set, I think it says you understand your project, you really know what makes the difference, and you have a much better shot at managing those things simultaneously to a successful launch.
All right, and here's another question for you, Erik. Can you talk more about the region above outstanding and when we'd want to push that way versus stopping?
Oh yeah, okay. That's actually an interesting area. Why is there an outstanding? Because you think more is better. In the requirements class, I used to use an example of overhead projectors because conference rooms used to have overhead projectors on the ceiling and they would make noise while I was trying to teach. So one of the exercises was to write a quality and performance requirement for the noise that thing makes. And guess what? Minimum, target, and outstanding are also keywords that can be used in competitive engineering to specify levels in any old requirement. They aren't just for landing zone entries. And I used to ask people what the outstanding noise level was for an overhead projector, and people who weren't acoustic experts would say 0 decibels. I'd say, really, are you sure about that? And back at Intel, I remember we did some studies, and the quietest room we could ever find was in rural Sweden overnight, where the microphones picked up only 20.5 decibels of background noise. So if you make your device quieter than 20.5 decibels, it's silent. At 19, it's silent. At 15, it's silent. At 0, it's silent. The engineering cost to get to 0 is infinite, and the cost to get below 20.5 are non-trivial. So should we go beyond outstanding is a very good question. And the answer, if the answer is yes, we'll take more if you can bring more. We think that's as much as we'd ever get. But if you happen to stumble on some innovation that gets us more, we'll take more. You can do that. In competitive engineering, that word is wish. And you can wish for it to be true, even if it may not be feasible, so far as the state of the art and your knowledge. So generally, you don't go beyond outstanding without going to ask, because there may be no benefit in doing so. You're just adding money to something to make it better, polishing that pearl until it just vanishes at great cost. So always ask before going beyond outstanding. Figure out whether there's a wish out to the right that you could pursue, or whether the answer is no. If you've hit outstanding, stop, and let's redirect your brain power and your resources to something down closer to minimum where we want to get it moved up to target. Make sense? I hope, whoever asked.
We won't know because we can't hear their feedback right now unless they email me, Erik. But
yeah, the outstanding,
I'll go ahead
because there can be too much of a good thing.
I'll go ahead to the next question here.
Great.
Do you have recommendations for how we involve external stakeholders with landing zone management, as sometimes the information it contains may be confidential to the organization?
Okay. I have to be careful how I say this. And I think that's ironic because it's the nature of this question. I have seen in the past, places I cannot mention, where there were two landing zones. There was a landing zone that was published, and then there was the landing zone, which was not. And the landing zone that was published was purposely populated with surrogates, things that were not the actual success criteria, which were deeply sensitive, company confidential, trade secret level that no one outside of 3 to 5 people in a 100,000 person organization would be allowed to know. Those were the real success criteria. But what you can sometimes do is look for a proxy, something else that isn't that sensitive thing that would give you that kind of direct correlation and still be publishable. So if you find yourself in the rarefied atmosphere of having to protect something that sensitive, you could look for a proxy, a stand-in, if you will, something that's strongly correlated with what you're measuring, but not that thing explicitly stated. Now, maybe that's an overkill answer for the question, and there can be simpler ways to let people give you input on things like this without exposing the actual numbers. But these things tend to be that way, though, these landing zones, right? At Intel, these landing zones would govern product lines that were worth $10 billion over their life, with a B. And the data that's inside these would be a little interesting to your competition, wouldn't it? And so, yeah, sometimes these things get to the point where they have to be kept very confidential in terms of the core data, but you still want to have a transparent definition of success that other teams are working to. If you went to grad school in computer science, maybe you, like I did, I worked on a project for modeling superfluid vortices in helium, a few millionths of a degree above absolute zero. And it was funded by DARPA, and we had no idea what we were really doing. They gave us criteria for success. The best we could tell, we were doing something in support of a superfluid wind tunnel. But nobody told us that. We had to guess from a distance. So that kind of thing goes on all the time. You just never really know sometimes what you're really working on.
Fantastic, Eric. I think that'll end it for our Q&A session today, but thank you for the great presentation. We'll end it on that kind of tricky question that you had to bounce around on. And thanks everyone else for tuning in and bearing with our strange Q&A process today and sending your emails. If you have more questions, feel free again to reach out to me or Eric, and I'll get you in touch with him, and we'll try to answer your questions as best we can. Just as a reminder, we'll be hosting another webinar on September 15th with another Construx Senior Fellow. This time it will be Earl Beatty, who will be talking about value stream mapping for DevOps. We look forward to seeing you next time, and until then, I hope you stay healthy and stay safe. Eric, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, and go make something good happen with this.